In this very rich passage from St. John's Gospel about the healing of a man born blind, the Pharisees go to the greatest lengths to avoid seeing that God was in fact at work in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. It had been unheard of that a person who was known to be blind from birth was ever healed. So to avoid having to recognize that Jesus is in fact the Christ, as plainly proved by such a miracle, the Pharisees chose rather to doubt that the man was ever really blind from birth. They also reasoned that Jesus is a sinner because this work was performed on the Sabbath. And so this overly scrupulous interpretation of the religious law further blinds them to the true identity of Jesus. Why were these otherwise good and sincerely religious people, the Pharisees, unable to see the truth right in front of them? The plain truth that Jesus is not only from God, he's God's only Son, the Anointed One, the long-awaited Messiah. Perhaps because, as people of religion, they thought they knew God better than anyone else. They assumed that they knew where to find God and how to recognize God's works. To the Pharisees, God was primarily to be found in the temple, and there contained within the Ark of the Covenant, behind the veil of the Holy of Holies, amid the clouds of incense offered there. When the Messiah of God came, they thought he would not come as an ordinary-looking man, an itinerant preacher from backwater Galilee, but rather as a triumphant military leader. He would not be milling about with the crowds in the streets and marketplaces of the city. Rather, he would enter the temple majestically through the golden gate. Jesus was not at all what they were expecting, so they refused to look and to really see. One of the best known and clearly the most popular hymns in our culture is Amazing Grace. And it should be clear to us that the composer of that hymn took the end of the first stanza directly from today's gospel reading. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Such a popular hymn is frequently sung by religious people of every Christian denomination. But it raises the question, are we really willing to accept the possibility of our own spiritual blindness? And are we prepared to be healed of it through the grace of God? Because like the Pharisees before us, we as religious people may tend to be a bit too certain about the ways of God. We may feel that we know where to find God and how to recognize God's works. As Roman Catholics in particular, we might be especially vulnerable to some spiritual blindness. For we may believe that Jesus is found primarily, maybe even exclusively, in church. Indeed, in the tabernacle, we're safe behind that locked door. He's to be adored, but he doesn't have to put too many demands on us. And while without doubt Jesus is truly present here, we have to constantly ask ourselves and him where else he might be found. What aren't we seeing? What are we refusing to recognize? Where might God be at work right in front of us? Yet, like the Pharisees, we are unable because we are unwilling to see. As with the healing of the man blind from birth, God may in fact be at work right where we are rather certain he is not. Indeed, in people, places, and circumstances that we might find unacceptable or even unpleasant. For the blind man in the story, remember, is at the very bottom of the social heap. He was, because of his disability, forced to be a beggar in the streets. He was someone whom people of privilege, like the Pharisees, thought to be cursed by his own sins or those of his parents. And therefore, he was someone who deserved his lot, they thought. Someone to be shunned and avoided. Surely this blind beggar might merit people's pity, but he was hardly worthy, in their way of thinking, of God's special favor. Yet Jesus demonstrates that things aren't really what they seem to be as he blesses that blind man with sight. So let us ask ourselves, who is it that we would prefer to avoid? Whom might we have judged as cursed by their own sinfulness, meriting maybe our pity, but not worthy of God's love? Sometimes it's individuals. Other times, sadly, it's whole classes of people who end up demonized, maybe because of their race, their religion, their manner of life, their orientation, their social or legal status. Victims of the judgments we make rather blindly, yet believing all the while that we can see. We are presented this gospel on this, the fourth Sunday of the season of Lent, a season that constantly invites us to our own starkly honest introspection in order that we might continue to make progress on the path of authentic conversion, which is always our task. So let us ask God today to heal us of our blindness, if necessary. Indeed, enlightened by Christ, who is the very light of the world, may we see not the faults of others primarily, but our own more clearly, and trust as we do that under God's amazing grace, clearer vision will bring us a change of mind and heart.